So, hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Anna Harris-Noble to host today's webinar on what I think is your first visit to the Wine Scholar Guild studio. So, a very warm welcome
Yes.
to you, Anna. Anna, if you don't know, Anna has been working in the wine industry for the best part of 2 decades across wine education and wine journalism and wine as a wine PR professional, but joins us today in her capacity as the regional ambassador for Spain for the Old Vine Conference, which is the subject of today's webinar. So, Anna, if you're ready, I'll hand the reins over to you, and I will pop back up at the end for the Q&A. So, Anna, it's all yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Justin. So yes, thank you very much for attending. I'm aware that this subject at first glance, legislation, might sound a bit dry. So thank you very much for coming along. But I hope by the end of the presentation, you'll see that it actually offers it raises a whole range of different issues, different questions for discussion. And like anything in wine, especially Spanish wine, nothing is black and white. It's every shade of rosé, red, orange, tawny, all the shades in between. So I hope you enjoy it, and please do ask any questions. There's a huge amount of information that I could have included. So some of the slides I'll kind of gloss over quite quickly, but if you have any questions and you want me to explain anything in more detail, we can go back at the end. So as Justin mentioned, am the regional ambassador for Spain. I lived in Spain. I actually have dual nationality now, Spanish and British, and I lived in Spain for a number of years, working for a number of different wineries and also teaching WCT courses, among others. And I became involved in the Old Vine Conference a couple of years ago because I saw that they didn't have a Spanish wine ambassador on board at the conference. And I put myself forward because it's a subject that's really close to my heart. So what is the Old Vine Conference? I'm sure a lot of you have been to other presentations that have been hosted about the conference, so I won't speak too long. But basically, it's a non-for-profit organisation founded in 2021 with an aim to create a category around the world for old vine wines and to promote old vine wines so that the wines can reach a price that reflects all the work that goes into maintaining a heritage vineyard, and that ultimately the grape grower at the end of the chain gets a price that is sustainable and means that they can afford to keep these vines in the ground, because as we'll see, particularly in the case of Spain, that hasn't always been the case. That that and it's still in many regions not the case that the wine growing that goes into a bottle of wine is not sustainable. So I think it's a really important subject. And the Old Vine Conference, aside from the conference which they organise usually in October every year, until now it's been online, but next year it's going to take place in a physical format in California, which is very exciting. They also organise a number of different promotional activities, press trips, tastings, research. And one of the things that they do is they have worked with Jancis Robinson, who first started the Old Vine Registry, to create a database of living historic vineyard sites. And it's kind of like a Wikipedia for vines, if you will. So anyone can enter a vine that they're aware of around the world. And to date, there's 3,500 vineyards on there from 36 countries. And I thought it was interesting to point out that 445 are in Spain. That's only a tiny number of what there actually are. And one of my jobs on my to-do list is to get people uploading new vines. They've actually got a competition this year. So to find out who uploads the most vines, they've got some interesting prizes. So it's worth taking a look. The oldest vineyard in Spain on their registry is over 200 years old. It's in the Rías Baixas and was planted in 1823. They think. Whether that's true is, as we'll see, registries aren't always up to date in Spain. Could be even older. So why old vines? There's a number of scientific reasons that people often talk about. You know, the old vines can produce more concentrated grapes that produce wines that have more structure and are great for aging. They taste delicious. Also, old vineyards are a haven of biodiversity. Often we can find old vines there that were planted before the introduction of certain clones. So, you know, biodiversity is a really important topic these days. But personally, the reason why I became regional ambassador was because of the human stories that I heard behind old vines in Spain. I lived in Spain for a number of years. And more recently, one of the stories I heard when we were in Jumilla on an old vine conference trip earlier this year was Viña Elena is a winery in Jumilla which produces a number of old vine wines from Monastrell and other grapes, including Airen. And I asked them about their oldest parcel, and they said it's 55 years old, and it belonged to Manolo, who's 75 years old now. And the reason this parcel had survived when others had been grubbed up to get EU subsidies for restructuring vineyards was because that Manolo remembered that his father taught him to graft in this parcel. And there are actually vines in the parcel that have one arm of Airen and one of Monastrell on the same trunk, because that was what they were doing. They were practicing head grafting, and so they have these incredible living relics that for Manolo have a huge personal significance. And Elena Pacheco, who runs the winery now, said, you know, Manolo is coming up to retirement. He's 75 years old, and you know, they don't know what will happen to this vineyard when he retires. One of the most common stories I hear across Spain is that elderly people, they can no longer look after the vines, but their children have often moved to the cities. There's a huge problem with rural depopulation in Spain, so people leaving the countryside, moving to the cities, and there isn't the workforce there to look after the old vines. So this is a problem we see all over Spain. And to talk about the situation in Spain in a bit more detail, these are some slides that were presented by Juan Carlos Sancha, who's a lecturer. He's incredibly knowledgeable about Spain's old vine heritage, and he's spoken at a number of old vine conferences. He also produces some fantastic old vine wines from Rioja. Peña del Gato is one of them. It's well worth trying. And he claims that Spain is the country which has lost more vineyard than any other in the world. So this says in Spanish, we've grubbed up almost 700,000 hectares of vineyards. This graph here shows in 1980, Spain had just over 1.5 million hectares of vineyard, and it produced about 25 million hectolitres per year. Today, Spain has just under 1 million hectares, so 950,000 hectares, and a potential of 45 million hectolitres, according to the Ministry of Agriculture. So it's lost vineyard, but it can paradoxically produce more wine. Why? Because of the EU's restructuring plans that were implemented in 2001, where the aim was to optimize and renew older vineyards. Now, often what happened was that the older, less productive vineyards in harder to farm areas were grubbed up and replaced with trellised vineyards that could be mechanized more easily, that could be irrigated. And so nearly half of the current vineyard area has been renewed, and 500,000 hectares have been lost in that time. Now, nobody in the Old Vine Conference thinks that no vine should ever be grubbed up. That, you know, of course we need to plant new vines to grow old, to have quality vineyards in the future. But, it is concerning that Spain has lost and will continue to lose very precious heritage vineyards unless we really show why these vineyards are so special, and why they should be protected. And legislation will be part of that. This graph here actually shows how much the vineyard area of vines aged more than 40 years or more has fallen. So about over 30% in the 1980s, and then going down to 10% in 2014. This picture was one that I thought was interesting because this is still a live issue. So this is taken a couple of weeks ago in Logroño, where farmers were protesting against the price that their grapes get in the market, because there's still supply and demand. And as wine consumption falls around the world, there needs to be a rebalance between the amount of wine that's produced and the amount of wine that is drunk, and moving towards more quality wines is part of that. Of course, it's not all bad. There's been a huge number of different projects that have taken place over the last 20 years or so, 20 to 30 years, aimed at moving away from the traditional aging classification structure in Spain. And Juan Carlos Sancho, when he speaks, often talks about how if he was a carpenter, he'd sell wood, but he's not. He is a grape grower, so he wants to sell wine. And so he's one of the great proponents of moving away from the traditional crianza reserva system, based on the amount of time that the wine spent in oak and the aging, and moving to a more terroir-based system. And there's been, I can't fail to mention Alvaro Palacios, who produces La Ermita, who's been absolutely instrumental in changing the perception and the prestige of certain vineyards. And he, worked with Priorat to create a new classification system that we'll look at in more detail. This is La Ermita, one of Spain's most expensive sought-after wines, which is classed as a Gran Viña Clasificada from Priorat, which does mean that there is a legislated minimum vine age. Here we have Fernando Mora, who's a master of wine, wearing a Save the Old Vines t-shirt, you may see. He has been working in Aragon, in an area which is actually outside of the DOs, Valle Jalón, to restore some beautiful valleys which used to be covered in vineyards, but a lot of them had been abandoned, grubbed up. So he's been buying different parcels from old growers and restoring this whole vineyard to create fantastic wines, mainly from Garnacha. That's his sort of favoured red grape. Bodega Son Sierra is an interesting case because they're actually a cooperative. And like many cooperatives, a lot of the volume of their production is selling wines and selling bulk wine to other wineries. So it turns up on shelf under very different brand names. They also bottle their own wines, and Crianza Reserva, the traditional styles. But in 2017, they introduced they opened a new boutique vineyard to separate out all their fruit aged over 40 years and to vinify by parcel. And because they have access to so many old vine parcels, because they're a cooperative, around the village of San Vicente de la Sonsierra, which is, famed for its quality in the Rioja Alta, they now produce more Viñedo Singular wines than any other winery in the area. And this is a wine that they produce as part of this project, which says Viñedo Viejo on the label. And as we'll see, that is legislated. That term in Rioja, the use of that term is controlled. And there's also, stories of old varieties that had almost been lost being recovered. Torres have played a huge role in that. A lot of the old varieties that were found in Spain stopped being grown because they were often low yielding. They often only ripened in the warmest years. But with climate change, these varieties often offer a huge potential because, they have ripening cycles that mean that they can conserve their freshness even in hotter years. And so there's been a lot of work to recover some of those. Rueda, for example, has just introduced a red grape called Cenicienta, which is the Spanish term for Cinderella, which is rather marvelous, I think. But this is one of the grapes that was part of an experimental project organised by Castilla Leon to recover some historic grape varieties. And then there's other producers who are showing that even underrated grapes like Bobal and Airen can produce incredible wines when they're made from very old, low-yielding vines. So, for example, Bodegas Hispano-Suizas in Utierrequena makes some amazing old vine Bobal. Bodegas Verum and Bodegas Cerrón in Verum is in Toledo and Cerrón is in Jumilla. Make some Airen which tasted blind, you might think was Burgundy. So far from being a grape just for producing brandy, it can produce marvelous wines when it's from old vines as well. We have 6 Spanish members at the moment of the Old Vine Conference. One's coming on board at the start of 2025. 2 of them are DOs, which I'll talk about more when I'm talking about the designation of origins, different categories and legislation. And then there's 4 Spanish winery members. Now, you might have had the opportunity to hear a presentation by Andreas Kubak, who runs Bodegas Bidiona in Rioja Alavesa. He's a master of wine and he's a really good speaker. I think you can find some of his previous presentations on the Wine Scholar Guild channel. But one of the Bodegas Bidiona is aimed at showing the variety and the heritage of different villages throughout the Rioja Alavesa. And one of the really interesting maps that he shows is of a typical vineyard planted in Rioja Alavesa in 1945, which shows all the different varieties that are within one small parcel. There's actually 12 different varieties planted in this parcel. Some of them, they don't even know what they are. It's mainly Tempranillo, but there's also ancient varieties like Benedicto, which is one of the parent grape varieties of Tempranillo. There's white grapes like Viura. So it really shows the value of these vineyards in terms of biodiversity, in terms of creating really exciting field blends as well. Numancia it was one of the first members of the Old Vine Conference, and they produce one of Spain's most sought after wines, Termancia, which sells for hundreds of euros a bottle, and that's made from ungrafted vines in the Dio Toro as old as 200 years old. So really old vines and a really concentrated, age-worthy wine. It's very interesting to taste and lasts over 10 years, as I've seen in tasting. Torre de Oña is a new winery member. It's a lovely boutique chateau-style estate winery in the Rioja Alavesa. In 2021, it started a new project called Viñedos Artesanales to recover centuries-old vines, and they're going to launch their first wine in that range this year. So they wanted to come on board to highlight that. And then a new winery that's coming on board for 2025 is Bodegas Queiron, which is in Rioja Oriental, formerly known as Rioja Baja. They're based in a village called Quel, which is a really interesting village, which incredibly, I lived in Rioja for a year, and I hadn't visited this village before this year. It has houses on one side of the river built into a huge rock, and then on the other side of the river it has another rock with what's known as a barrio de bodegas, so an ancient winery quarter or district where historically different people would produce their own homemade wine in their tiny. They had their own little winery, and there's dozens of these little wineries built into the rock, and it's a system where the grapes would come by donkey down from the vineyards, which are at higher altitude, and there's these kind of chutes at the top that you can see at the top, the road that goes along the top, where they will place the grapes and then fed down by gravity. And they've actually restored one of these old wineries, which is very interesting to visit. And they produce some village wines that showcase Kel and Vinos de Pueblo, which we'll talk about more. And they also produce El Arca, which is a viñedo singular, so a singular vineyard wine, which I'll explain a bit more about later as well, planted mainly with Garnacha in the 19th century. So there's a huge number of things happening in Spain, private enterprises, some of them based on legislation. As we've said, the Viñedo Singular is legislation that Rioja has introduced recently in 2017. So is legislation necessary if all these positive projects are happening already? Well, I thought to talk about this, it was interesting to quickly mention the Old Vine Project, which is a project that started in South Africa. It's a non-profit-based company that certifies the planting dates of vineyards that are 35 years or older. And they've introduced this vineyard certification seal. So this certifies that the grapes that we use to make this wine come from vineyards that are over 35 years. And in fact, these vineyards were planted in 1974. So as part of this, they did some research with the university that showed that, in fact, a price could be put on the year that the vineyard was planted. And they found that almost 3 rand, which I had to look up how much that is in euros, it's about 15 cents, which doesn't sound like much. But if you think 10 years, if a wine's 10 years more, that means €1.50 more of value. If when a vine reaches old age, so 35 years in their certification system, that's a €5.40 premium. But interestingly, they find just putting old vines on the front label without any information on the back label, or the certification seal, actually had a negative effect on pricing. And they said, well, why is that? Well, number one, without the story on the back label doesn't necessarily mean much to most people. What does old vine mean? Some people know, but your average consumer wouldn't really know what that means and why it was potentially better. Also, without certification, is it something that's credible? Unless there's someone saying that you can only put old vines on the label if they're aged a certain age, and they certify that in some way, then of course anyone could put old vines on the label, whether it was true or not. Now, commercially, it doesn't necessarily make much sense to fib on your wine label, but of course, we do know that unless you legislate these things, some people will always push the boundaries. So let's get back to Spain. Now, of course, it's worth mentioning that comparing Spain, South Africa, where they've been able to implement this project, to Spain is, Spain is a whole different kettle of fish. There's 1,400 hectares of vines in the whole of South Africa, whereas in Spain, there's 1,640,000 in La Mancha alone. Spain's vineyard area is almost 10 times the size of South Africa's. South Africa's is also concentrated in the Western Cape area, in the southern and west area of South Africa, whereas in Spain it's spread over a huge area, including some islands. Spain is also a very mountainous country. So there's a lot of mountain ranges that have separated parts of the country for hundreds, thousands of years. They made it very difficult to travel across the country. So, which is why, you find great diversity and grape varieties across the country. I lived in Madrid, and I couldn't understand for a long time why it took me so much longer to boil an egg in Madrid as it did in the UK. um, I was expecting, an egg would be done after 3.5 minutes. But then I realized that the reason it takes so much longer is because Madrid is actually one of the highest capitals in Europe. It's the second highest capital in Europe, over 500 meters above sea level, 600 meters, which means that it actually takes almost a minute more to cook something in boiling water than it does in the UK, where I'm from. It's almost at sea level. So you've got these very diverse areas, lots of different mountain ranges, very diverse geology, which means that it's very hard, number one, to say how old vines should be. As we've said, in Rias Baixas, where there's over 1,000 millimeters of rain on average throughout the growing season, compared to Jumilla, where there's 300 millimeters. You're talking about very different environments, very different conditions for vines to have to survive in. So therefore, there are, as we'll see in a moment, a huge number of different aging categories across the different DOs. There's also, in terms of legislating, it's very complicated because there are so many different DOs. And that takes me to, so who controls the legislation when it comes to wine? Of course, Spain is in the EU. So EU legislation governs Spanish wine law, but the Spanish government can also apply local laws. So the traditional terms like crianza and reserva, they are governed by Spanish wine law. And then you have these different categories, which, depending where they fall, will be governed by different bodies. So as you go up the pyramid, you get to smaller and smaller units, to a vino de pago, which is basically in a single estate. So here at Vino de España level, there's a lot less legislation, a lot fewer rules than there are at DO level, which is where most of Spain's export wines are the level that they are labelled under. So I think I'll mention some. This is, as I said, one of the slides where I could talk for a very long time, but I think we'll come back to some of the terms that are mentioned here in a moment. So what's on the shelf? I've pulled up some pictures of some wines that are sold here in the UK that mention old vine Garnacha on here. Now, obviously, this is a DO wine. So this is from DO Calatayud. It says Old Vine Garnacha on the label. Now, DO Calatayud has its legislation, which adds to Spanish wine law. So on top of Spanish wine law, it has its own rules that govern the yield that's allowed from its vineyard, govern the grape varieties that can be grown. And in this case, and this isn't the case for all DOs across Spain, it does mean that they have a rule pertaining to the labelling of wines that say old vines on them. So in this case, they have to be at least 35 years old. So if you buy this wine, you know that the grapes that went into the wine were from vineyards at over 35 years. Now, this case says the same, Old Vine Garnacha. But this is a wine of Spain. And there's a reason that this could only be sold as a wine of Spain, because it is in a can, and you can only sell DO wines in a bottle. So this wine was actually shipped in bulk. it's a great wine, and I love the canned wine format for certain situations. It's fantastic, and it's very high quality wine, but it's sold in can. Therefore, it can't be labelled as a DO. Even if it did come from DO, it's been declassified to wine of Spain. And because in Spanish wine law, there's no rule in the conditions that say that if you put old vine on the label, the vines have to have a certain age. We don't 100% know, and I'm not saying that they're lying here. In fact, the Norrell Robertson, who's a master of wine, who makes his own wines under the label El Escocés Volante in Dio Calatayud, consulted on these two wine projects, and I actually spoke to him. And I said to him, what do you think of this situation? You're involved in, he makes his own wines from vineyards that are over 50 years old. Some of them are over 100 years old. And you also consult on these projects. You're involved in, selecting the wine that goes into this canned wine. And he said, well, they've got all great products, and you can't really be empirical about this because it depends so much on where the vineyard is planted and how it's managed. I've had incredible wines from young vineyards, and there are some old vineyards in a terrible state. If vineyards are cropped too high, they aren't viable after 20 to 25 years. But he then came back to me and said, by using the term old vines on a label, it means we can justify a premium price and pay up to €1.20 per kilo compared to 45 to 60 cents per kilo for younger vineyards. So in terms of what the grower gets paid, that's a very positive thing that, by having these terms on the label, the grower gets more money for their grapes. Now, what's the case across the DOs? So we have the situation that if it's non-DO wine, there's no legislation on how old the vines have to be classed as old. We also have the situation where across the different DOs, and these are just a fraction of the 70 DOs in Spain that say something about old vines classifications, it varies as well. So we can go from Dio Cariñena, their pliego de condiciones, so their statute says that if you put viñas viejas on the label, the wine has to come from grapes and vines over 20 years of age. Several regions say 30 years, so Rueda says 30 years, and also Jumilla has just added, and we'll look at Jumilla in more detail because it's one of our Old Vine Conference members, and they're doing some really interesting things there. They say 30 years, so it must be made with at least 85 grapes and vines older than 30 years of age. Campo de Borja didn't have legislation on this, but they've recently requested a change to their statute to incorporate the term garnachas históricas, which is a whole project that they've been developing with research, promotion of garnachas from historic vineyards. And for that, they say 35 years is the minimum. A region, the statute that I think is really interesting is Ribera del Duero. So the age, if you put viñas viejas on the label of a wine from Ribera del Duero, they must be over 35 years, and you must expressly state how old those vineyards are. So you can't just put old vines. You have to say on the back label, these grapes come from a vineyard that's X years old on the back label, 40 years old, 50 years old, or it was planted in whatever date. The same thing happens to them for the altitude of the vineyards. If you say high altitude vines, which is, all wine vineyards in Ribera del Duero could be classed as high altitude. So they say you have to say how high the altitude is on the back label. They also allow the use of the term viñedo centenario, so centenary vineyards, 100-year-old plus vineyards, and pre-phylloxerical vineyards, so pre-phylloxera, if it was planted prior to 1900. and the age when they state it, they say is based on the average age of their vineyard. So I think that's quite a complete and interesting way of doing it, because it gets over the problem that the South African research uncovered of having a backstory and having something to back it up. So actually saying on the back label how old the vineyards are. Rioja we'll look at in more detail, but they have recently changed their conditions to say that if you say old vine, it must have been planted prior to 1980. And I was slightly offended by this because I was actually born in 1980. So I thought, oh, is it saying I'm old? But then I thought, well, no, actually, it's saying that something that's 44 years old plus is in its prime and producing the highest quality grapes it possibly can. So I think that's a good way of looking at it, isn't it? They also mention the age of 35 years in the viñedo singular conditions, so the singular vineyard conditions, which again I'll talk about a little bit more. And then Calatayud, as we saw before on the old vine Garnacha label, is minimum 35 years. They also have a new category called Calatayud Superior, in which the vines have to be 50 years or more. And then Bierzo. And here I wanted to talk a bit about some of the DOs that don't mention a vineyard age are often the ones that have the most old vines. So Bierzo is a case in point. They have they say in their statute that 85% of the vines in the region are aged over 75 years or more, but they don't actually legislate that in their different categories. So they have a system of different parajes, so small vineyard areas that are now classified. You can put the name of a village or a smaller area on the label, but it doesn't say that the vineyards have to have a certain age. I asked them to comment on this, but they haven't got back to me yet. But I mean, my speculation is that when you've got a region where most of the vines are old, it doesn't really distinguish your wine as much as it does in an area where there are young and old vineyards to say that it's old vines. That's one way of looking at it. A similar thing happens in the areas outside Madrid, Diocebreros. 94% of the vineyards in Diocebreros are more than 50 years old. So does it make any sense to say old vines on the label? No, because pretty much all the vines are old in that area. Another interesting case is the Dio Priorat, which we'll look at in more detail, but to say Viñes Valles, the old vines on the label, they have to be 75 years or more. And they have a way of certifying that, because that is another big issue in Spain, the certification, which we'll look at in a moment. So it varies greatly. Now, I asked Jumilla why they hadn't chosen 30, 35, because the OIV has actually just released, and the Old Vine Conference was one of the organisations that helped define this. They've just released a new resolution this year saying that they agree an old vineyard is documented to be 35 years or older. And so they are recommending 35 years, and usually the EU eventually adopts what the OIV recommends. So at the moment, this is just a recommendation, but it could in the future become law. Well, is that going to be a problem for the regions where 35, which say that, you know, vineyards could be 30 or 25 or 20 years old? Well, I spoke to Jumilla and they said, well, the thing is, in our region where most of the vineyards are dry farmed, there's very little rainfall. For a for a vine to survive to 30 years is already a major achievement. So there is this question of whether one size fits all. But, you know, 35 years is what Old Vine Conference recognises, and the OIV. So that's one case. So, case in Rioja. I know you're going to have another presentation on Rioja next week, so I won't talk too much, but I think Rioja is a really interesting case in terms of the new categories that have been introduced, because one of them, Viñedo Singular, specifies that the vineyard must be aged at least 35 years or more. And there's a number of different rules pertaining to the vineyard and why it's special, lower yields, and it needs to be pass a tasting panel as well. The wine has to be tasted, but one of the criteria is the age of the vineyard. They now define old vines as being planted prior to 1980, as I mentioned before, viñedos centenarios, and the latter three mentions can be used across all of these categories. So Viñedo Singular is a category on its own, but these categories, so these are new terroir-based categories, can also be used alongside the historic aging categories. So I'm sure everyone's heard of Crianza Reserva, so it specifies the minimum aging in oak. So for example, Crianza, it must have spent at least a year in barrels, and they're not released until their third year from the winery. One thing I wanted to mention here is the traditional categories, although there's no legislation on the age of the vines, in practice, good quality producers will use older vineyards to make the older aging wines. Why? Because they need more concentrated fruit. If you're going to age your Gran Reserva for a minimum of 5 years, you need a wine that has more concentration, it has more structure, it has more acidity, more tannin to be able to last that long in oak and in the bottle. So in practice, and I know Almudena Alberca, a master of wine who's made wine across Spain, particularly in Ribera del Duero, has often said to me, the age of the wines, the vines that I use, correlates quite directly to the age that I want the wine to achieve. So if she wants a juicy, fresh wine for easy drinking, she'll use a higher percentage of young vines. So to make a roble, for example, in Ribera del Duero. If she wants it to age for longer, then she'll use a higher proportion of older vines. So it's not completely, though it wasn't legislated, the two things do go kind of hand in hand as well. Viñedos de Pueblo, this is a change where from what was called Vinos de Municipio. So in the past, you weren't allowed to put the village name that your grapes came from on the label, and they introduced a new category called Vinos de Municipio, and that's now been changed called Vinos de Pueblo. I don't think municipio sounded a bit like swimming pools. I think village wine is a much better term. But there are some producers like Bidiona, who I've mentioned before, who had to, who managed to get around these rules by creating names that almost looked like number plates. So VIBN4 was for their vineyards in Villabuena. Why did they do that? And why can they still not use Vinos de Villabuena on those labels? Well, because one of the rules that's in place here in Rioja is that if you use this label, the vineyard needs to be located in the same place as the winery. And there are a lot of producers who, Bidiona, for example, they have their vineyard in one town, but they produce wines from vineyards from lots of different villages. So they to cope with this, they have also introduced a new category called viñedos en. So you can put vineyards in a village and produce them in a different place. Now, Priorat. The the statute actually says that viejas viñas, old vineyards, deserve special protection given that they are the remains of natural, agricultural, and ethnological history of the Priorat. These are vineyards of more than 75 years old, or were planted before 1945. So they class old vines as 75 years old or planted before 1945. And they also, as you go up the category, they have specifications of age for the vineyard. So a village wine, 90% of the vines must be at least 10 years old. B de Parache, 90% must be at least 15 years old. Viña Clasificada, equivalent of Premier Cru, 80% must be 20 years old. And Gran Viña Clasificada, 80% must be 35 years old. And the remaining 20 must be used at least 10 years old. And then you can put onto the on top of that, if they're more than 75 years old, you can also use the term velles vins. Now, this raises the issue of certification. Why have they said 1945? Because that was one of the first flyovers of Spain. So in Spain, you often talk about the vuelos americanos, the American flights, because this was something carried out by the Allied forces to improve the cartography of Spain, which was very limited at that time. So in 1945, they organized a series of flights over the entire territory of Spain, taking photographs. And there are regions like Priorat that use these photographs to show where vineyards were in the past. It was carried out again in the 1950s and 1960s. So there are different, projects where people have looked at the changing use of the land over those times, and to see where vineyards were in the past and therefore how old those vineyards are. Now, why is this an issue? Because often certification in Spain is not 100% accurate. People would often plant vineyards and then not register them for years afterwards. And to combat this, the Campo de Borja is actually carrying out research to scientifically identify the age of vines as part of their Garnachas Históricas project. And Garnachas Históricas is a work and research group organized between the DO Campo de Borja and the largest wineries in the vineyard, and also the biggest two major universities. Located in Aragon, eastern Spain, Campo de Borja is known as the Empire of Garnacha, which makes up 57% of the plantings. And there are currently over 3,000 hectares of Garnacha in the vineyards in the region, of which 414 were planted prior to 1988. So they're more than 35 years old. This is only a small percentage of what existed last century. So they set up this project to try and save these old vines that do still exist and place greater value on them. And so there's two studies that they've been carrying out, which we look forward to hearing the results of next year. The first is how vine age affects aging capacity. As I said, there's a lot of sort of hearsay, talking about how wines from old vines can age for longer, but this will actually scientifically demonstrate why historic Garnacha plots have a better aging capacity than grapes from young vineyards. And the second piece of research, as I mentioned before, is to carry out a specific methodology to scientifically certify the age of old vines. So when they think, oh, this vineyard was registered in 1945, for example, but we think it's much older, well, they can look at this to look at various different factors on the plant, because it's not as simple as a tree where you can cut the trunk and count the number of rings. Vines don't grow like that, but they can look. They've been looking at, how the shoots form, how the lots of different things related to the vine itself that can indicate its age. Now, Jumilla is another member, and one of the really interesting things about Jumilla, apart from how extreme its climate is, it's a really dry, semi-arid region, is how many hectares of old vines they have. They have over 2,600 hectares of old vines, and over 1,000 of these are ungrafted. Now, how can you grow an ungrafted vine within the age of phylloxera? Well, because of the soils. We went to Jumilla earlier this year with a soil scientist, and he was amazed to see the active calcium that was in some of these soils that in theory they wouldn't be able to survive in, and certainly phylloxera can't survive in them. There's also very sandy, there's huge, again, mountain ranges that separate the region, and so phylloxera has not really been a problem there. The issue is, of course, that the EU doesn't allow you to plant on ungrafted vineyards. So the ones that are ungrafted are a real treasure to preserve. And actually, they use traditional techniques of acodo to replant the missing vines within these vineyards. And they've introduced new legislation to talk about old vines. So at least 85% of grapes come from vines aged 30 years or more. They can put old vines, Viña Vieja, on the label, and they will be able to put Pie Franco, ungrafted, when they come from vines planted without rootstock. So some really interesting new projects there. And I think that brings me to the end. As I said, I've had to kind of move quickly over some of the topics. Hopefully you've seen that there's a huge amount of work that's being done in Spain to help preserve the old vine heritage that the country has, but there's still a long way to go. And legislation is one of the ways that these old vines can be protective. So thank you.
Thanks, Anna. That was really, really interesting. Lots of work gone into your presentation as well. So thank you very much from all of us for putting that together. I really, really enjoyed your presentation. Members, we do have a few minutes left, so there is a chance for you to ask any questions. If you want to, you just pop them into the Q&A box. As we wait for those to come in, we'll see if we get any, Anna. I was going to ask a question actually about one of the things that we've sort of had from previous presentations we've had on old vines about vines getting older and sort of the quality of the fruit getting better and the kind of that organoleptic change we actually get in the wines. But obviously, like all these different regions of Spain are so different in their designations of what they consider to be an old vine. I was just wondering, in your experience from a taste point of view, whether or not you find there's a sort of like sweet spot for vine age, or what, is there a difference in the quality of the fruit between, say, a 35-year-old vine and a 70-year-old vine, and to what extent does it make sense to sort of keep them for longer?
Oh, goodness, that would be a really tough blind tasting, wouldn't it, to identify the age of the vines that went. I mean, no, joking aside, I think one of the really interesting ones is the new trend I think I was mentioning to you before, for old vine Airen is a really interesting thing that people have been talking about in recent years, because Airen is a grape that I'm sure lots of people know. It's the most widely planted grape across Spain. And until quite recently, I think it was just overtaken by Tempranillo. But it's a grape that you never used to see on the label because it would maybe be used to make the base wines for brandy. It's planted mainly across La Mancha, but you also find in Jumilla and some other regions as well. And as I say, it's kind of an unknown grape that no one knew anything about. But there's some producers now who are using Airen from very old vineyards, 70, 80, 100 years old, to make really interesting wines. And I think I was saying to you before, Bodega Cerrón produces a wine called El
Yeah,
Terricon,
written it down.
which is just incredible. It's tastes like a white Burgundy. And the same with Monastrell. Monastrell is a grape where, you know, people think of Monastrell as being kind of gluggable, fruity, easy to drink. You know, yes, it can be a bit tannic, but you'd get an old vine Monastrell and it's got incredible structure, it's got incredible length. And I think the same happens with Garnacha as well, because Garnacha, when it's quite young, it tends to be alcoholic in terms of structure, doesn't have a lot of tannin. So you're relying on the acidity that old vines and higher altitude can give
Mm.
you. So I think there's a big difference that you can see between a young Garnacha, which is very fruity, easy to drink, pleasant, great wines, often amazing value for money. But the old vineyards can give you incredibly long aged wines. I mean, the example of Comando G and the wines from Cebreros is one that's, you know, really stands out there. And also what Fernando Mora and Noro Robertson are doing with Garnacha in Aragon. Some old vines from old vine garnachas I've tasted from Campo de Borja as well, where they've got so much tannin, you think, hang on, has this been blended with something else? But it's those really high altitude old vines that give them such concentration and power, where
Mm.
often the younger vines, you know, don't have that so much.
Well, thank you. And yeah, thanks again for putting that presentation together. We're pretty much on the hour, so I'll wrap things up there. But it's been just really, it's really fascinating to see all the different approaches by different
Mm.
appellations or denominación in Spain, but also quite heartwarming to know sort of how much this is kind of part of the conversation, I guess, in modern Spain and how these moves are being made to protect that heritage. So thanks, Anna. It's been an absolute joy to have you in the studio, and thanks again for putting that presentation together for us. And members watching wherever you might be, thanks for joining us. I hope you'll be back next week while we continue our exploration, looking this time at modern Rioja. So I'll hope to see you then. But in the meantime, I'll bid you all farewell. So thanks, members, for joining us, and a final thank you to you, Anna. We'd love to have you back to explore this
Thank you.
further at a later stage.
I'd love to come back. Thanks very much. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Bye bye.